Claire Landry pressed herself into the shadows behind the stacked hay bales. Breath clamped tight in her throat. Her wrists raw from the manacles that bound them. Outside, the lantern light retreated down the trail toward the house, weaving through, the pine silhouettes like a snake winding toward the nest. Claire didn't need to see the man's face to know it was her father's overseer, Boone, doing another sweep to make sure his prize was still caged. The cold bit deeper after the door shut. Spring had come to the valley, but here in the high Sierra foothills, the night still gnawed with fangs of frost. She shifted slightly, her spine screaming where the iron chains forced her to sit hunched. A clink echoed as she moved, just a brush of metal on wood, but it was enough to send her heart into her throat. Claire Landry had once been the daughter of a cattle baron with a dozen suitors and Sunday dresses imported from San Francisco, but now she was livestock, bartered away in silence during a whiskey-soaked handshake between her father and a man named Felix Carradine, a land baron whose eyes hadn't left her since the first day he rode up to their ranch on that black gelding, a ring the size of a coin already burning in his vest pocket. He'd spoken of fencing off valleys, of mineral rights and children, as if she were some irrigation plan to be discussed with the soil. The wedding was to be in 2 days, or so they said. Claire no longer trusted any word spoken aloud in that house. The first night after her father shook hands with Carradine, she tried to run, not far, just down to the river, but Boone had caught her before the current could. He hadn't spoken when he dragged her back, hadn't needed to. The look in his eyes, flat, unblinking, like the eyes of something that once wore a man's face, was warning enough. The second night, they locked her in the barn, chained her like a feral dog, told her they'd keep her safe from her own hysterics. Tonight was the third. And something was different. She could feel it in her bones. The air had a strange weight to it, silent but too still. Not a dog barked, not a cricket clicked. Even the horses in the stalls, usually restless when she wept, stood like statues, their ears pinned forward, eyes wide. Then came the sound. A whisper, no louder than a dry leaf shifting on the ground, but sharp, intentional. Her head jerked up. She tried to turn, but the chains stopped her short. All she could do was lean to the side and stare toward the barn door. Nothing. Nothing. Then, a shadow moved. It slipped along the bottom edge of the door, stretching long against the floorboards before shortening again. A silhouette. Tall, silent, not Boone. Boone stomped like a bear and always cursed before entering. Not Carradine. He reeked of leather and pipe smoke and a smugness that bled into every step. No sound. Then the door opened, just enough for moonlight to peel across the dirt floor. She didn't scream. Couldn't. Even when she saw the stranger's eyes, dark and unblinking, sharp as obsidian, watching her from the darkness like an animal weighing danger. He stepped in, a blur of rawhide and fringed buckskin, moccasins soft against the floor. His face was streaked with dirt and paint, jaw set, hair braided tight. She recognized the shape of his cheekbones, the color of his skin. Apache. He raised a hand. Not a greeting, just a signal. Quiet. Claire stared at him, frozen. Then, in a single fluid motion, he crouched and moved toward her, gliding between hay, bales, ducking under the rusted lantern chain that hung from the ceiling. A knife appeared in his hand, not drawn from a sheath, just suddenly there, catching the moonlight like a shard of silver. Her heart pounded against her ribs as he reached. She tried to speak, but her throat failed her. He held up the knife, then turned it, carefully placing the edge against the chain. Steel touched steel. Then, click. The manacle around her left wrist snapped open. Claire inhaled sharply. He moved again, precise, silent, freeing her right wrist, then guiding her to her feet. She stumbled, knees weak from days of kneeling on hard planks, but his hands steadied her, calloused, strong, gentle. Then he pointed toward the rear wall of the barn. A crack barely wider than a rabbit's path had been pried open between two boards, enough for a body if one was willing to scrape. Claire nodded. They moved. The boards groaned faintly as she slipped through, her dress catching on a nail, tearing loud enough to make her flinch. But no shout came, no alarm. The Apache followed, slipping through like smoke. Outside, the moon hung low behind a curtain of clouds. The forest swayed in the wind, whispering warnings to those who dared move through it. Claire stumbled as her bare feet hit the earth. Cold, damp, sharp with pine needles. But the Apache caught her elbow and steadied her again. She turned to him. "Who?" Her voice cracked. "Why?" He didn't answer, just tilted his head, then moved. They vanished into the trees. Behind them, the barn sat quiet as a tomb. No one saw. No one knew. Not yet. But they would. And blood would follow. Claire's breath came in bursts as the cold slapped her face. Each step a stumble through underbrush that snagged her skirt and bit into her skin. The earth was a patchwork of moss and frost, twisted roots and jagged stone. But the Apache moved through it like it remembered him, like he belonged to it. He never looked back. Not once. Yet every time she faltered, his hand would reach behind without turning, steadying her elbow, guiding her over a fallen log, or lifting her skirt free of a thorn patch. He didn't speak. She hadn't expected him to. She didn't know what she had expected. Maybe some whisper of his name, or even a question. "Who are you? Why were you chained?" But the silence was complete. Not cold, not cruel, just practiced. Like a man who'd learned long ago that quiet was the only safe language left. The Thai woods deepened. Pines stretched tall above them, black silhouettes against a gunmetal sky. The wind picked up as they climbed higher, cutting through the trees with a low moan that set Claire's nerves on edge. She'd never been in the forest, this far past the northern ridge. Her father had always warned her about savage land, unmapped, untamed. He used to say it like a curse. But now, with every step she took into that wild unknown, it felt more like salvation. Claire opened her mouth to ask where they were going, but the Apache turned suddenly, holding a hand out, flat, still. She froze. He crouched low, pressing his fingers into the dirt. Then he shifted, angling his head as if listening for something beneath the soil itself. For a moment, the only sound was her own heartbeat, loud and panicked in her ears. Then she heard it too. Distant. Hoofbeats. She spun toward the sound, panic flaring, but he caught her wrist, his touch firm, unyielding, and shook his head. Then he pointed northeast, up the slope where the trees grew thicker and the shadows were blacker than pitch. They moved again, faster now. Claire's legs ached. Her breath burned in her lungs. The chain welts on her wrists screamed each time her arms swung, but she kept going. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to, because in her gut, she knew. Boone had woken up, and Boone would come fast. The Apache led her up a ridge path barely wide enough for rabbits. At one point, he motioned for her to crouch, and they crawled beneath a wall of brambles so dense it scratched her scalp and tore strands from her hair. She winced, bit her tongue, and kept crawling. Then they reached a break in the trees. It opened into a narrow clearing overlooking the valley below. From here, she could see the farmhouse, a speck of amber light flickering in the dark, and the trail that led west. 3 riders galloped down it, torchlight flickering off their rifles. One of them she recognized instantly, the way he leaned forward, the set of his shoulders. Her father. Boone beside him. And Carradine. They were heading for the foothill pass. She felt sick. She sank down against a tree, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't cried once since the first night they locked her in that barn. But now the tears welled unbidden, the kind that scorched before they fell. Not out of fear. Not anymore. It was something else. A grief too old and too heavy for her to carry anymore. The Apache stood beside her, his gaze following the riders as they disappeared into the trees. Then, slowly, he crouched and withdrew something from the pouch at his side. A folded strip of dried meat, a water skin. He handed them both to her without a word. She took them with shaking fingers, whispered, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure he understood. He did not answer. Instead, he reached into the earth at the edge of the clearing and began to dig. Not deep, just enough to pull free a small leather-wrapped bundle. He unrolled it in the moonlight. A rifle, long-barreled, hand-carved, polished to a near sheen despite the wear. Claire had seen rifles before. Her father had dozens. But this one had a reverence about it, like it wasn't just a weapon. It was a story passed down through blood and fire. The Apache checked the sights, loaded it, then stood and scanned the horizon again. Claire didn't need to ask. They weren't just running anymore. They were being hunted. They stayed in that clearing just long enough to drink and rest. Then they vanished again into the timberline, moving higher toward the snow-patched peaks that ring the valley like the teeth of some great beast. Hours passed. The moon dipped lower, and Claire began to understand something. This man, this silent, stone-faced Apache, was not just guiding her out. He was risking everything for her. Every mile they moved north was a step deeper into enemy country. Not white territory, not Apache either. This was the land in between, no man's land, roamed by deserters, bandits, even other tribes who had no treaties with his. The kind of men who'd shoot a white woman on sight and leave the body to rot. Or worse, and yet he kept going. She wanted to ask him why. She wanted to know who had sent him. Did he owe someone a debt? Did he hate her father? Did he even know her name? But he didn't speak. Not that night. Not the next. By the third day, her feet were bleeding and her voice had gone hoarse from silence. She walked behind him like a ghost, her belly gnawing at itself, her limbs wooden from exhaustion. But still, she followed, because something inside her refused to die. Maybe it was the same part of her that had refused Carradine's first touch, had bitten Boone's hand when he grabbed her, had screamed until her throat bled the night they shackled her to the barn floor. She wasn't done yet, and neither was he. They reached a cave by dusk, a hollowed-out space hidden behind a curtain, of moss and vine, barely big enough for two people. The Apache crouched at the entrance, listened for a long moment, then nodded once before leading her inside. He started a fire without flint, striking iron on a shard of rock until sparks caught dry leaves. The warmth brought tears to her eyes. As the flames grew, she curled against the wall and watched him. He hadn't eaten, hadn't drunk anything since he gave her the last of the water. Now, he was sharpening the knife again, checking the rifle. Always watching. "Why me?" she whispered. He didn't look up. "You don't even know me. Nothing." Then at last, he glanced her way. Just once, long enough for her to see something flicker in his eyes. Not pity, not desire. Something older. Something hollow and dark. Regret. Then, in perfect, deliberate English, he said, "You remind me of someone." It was all he said, but it was enough. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and Claire Landry realized that for the first time since her mother's death, someone had seen her, not as property, not as a bargaining chip, but as someone worth saving, and someone was going to die for it. By the time the fire dimmed to embers, Claire's mind had wandered beyond the edges of exhaustion to places where thoughts became fragments and dreams, slipped into waking. Her body had long since surrendered to the ache of every step, the throb in her knees, the cracked soles of her feet, and the invisible, persistent weight of being hunted. She no longer tracked time by the sun or moon, but by the subtle changes in the Apache's posture. When he slowed, when he paused to listen, when he lifted his head like a hound tasting the wind. She didn't know his name, but his presence had become the only thing anchoring her to life. In his silence, there was something steadier than any voice she'd known before. something that didn't flinch from her pain or try to possess it. When he moved, she moved. When he stilled, she held her breath. That was how they survived. It was early morning when she awoke again, the fire down to a faint glow, and the air inside the cave thick with mist and the scent of pine smoke. Her limbs were slow to respond, stiff from cold and overuse, but she shifted upright with a quiet groan. The Apache was already crouched at the cave's mouth, his form a still silhouette against the faint grey dawn. He wasn't watching the trail. Behind them, not anymore. His eyes were to the east now, to the winding ridgelines that carved their way into Blackwood territory, deep into lands so wild and old they weren't marked on any settler's map. It was a dangerous path. She could see it in his eyes. And still, he'd chosen it. She swallowed, tasting ash on her tongue, then cleared her throat softly. They won't stop, will they? Her voice was rasped raw, barely more than a whisper. She didn't expect an answer, but after a long pause, he turned slightly and nodded once. It was enough. She leaned back against the cave wall and let her head rest there, closing her eyes for just a moment. Boone won't stop until he's bled every ounce of pride out of me. She opened her eyes again and looked at him. You saw what he did. How he kept me chained like some mongrel bitch in heat. Her voice cracked, but she didn't shy from it. My father let him. Said it was the price of land. Said I owed him something for all he gave up on my behalf. Her lips curled bitterly. He traded me like a sack of oats for 10 acres and a drunkard's word. The Apache didn't speak, but something flickered behind his eyes. Barely a twitch in the lines of his face. A tension that seemed to reach down into his shoulders and spine. She recognized it. Not pity, not shock, but a kind of recognition. As if pain had a scent and he knew it well. Maybe that was why he hadn't left her behind. Maybe that was why, when every other man had seen her as something to own or forget, this stranger had dragged her from iron and straw and firelight and vanished into the night, with her on his back like she was worth something. Later that morning, they moved again, this time with urgency. He didn't explain, but Claire saw the signs. The way he pressed his fingers to the dirt and stared at the horizon a beat too long. The way he stopped only to double-check the wind. Something was shifting, and it wasn't good. She didn't ask questions. The trail they followed grew narrower, sharper, winding through old hunting paths overhung with thick spruce and fir, where sunlight barely filtered down and the air tasted of lichen and wet rock. At one point, they passed an elk carcass, half buried, in snow, its ribs picked clean by wolves. The Apache paused to study it, then moved on without a word. They climbed for hours, steep, relentless, until they reached a break in the cliffs, where snow had melted into a rushing creek. He motioned for her to drink, and while she knelt to cup water into her hands, he crouched a few paces away and began drawing symbols in the dirt. They looked like directions, like a map etched into soil instead of paper. Claire watched him, silently, tracing the lines with her eyes. You know this land, she said. Like it's part of you. He gave a short nod, brushing the marks away as quickly as he'd made them, leaving only disturbed earth behind. By nightfall, they reached a place unlike any she'd seen. A basin nestled between two ridges, ringed by boulders and old pine, where the sky opened wide above and the stars felt close enough to touch. He led her into a thicket near the northern wall, where a shallow depression had been hidden beneath ferns and branches. An old scouts' camp, she guessed, though it had been disused for years. Still, it was safer than the open. He built a fire again, low and smokeless, and this time, when he handed her the last strip of dried meat, she pushed it back toward him. You need it more than me. He met her eyes, holding them for the first time without looking away. You carry 2 lives now, he said. She blinked. It was the first time he'd acknowledged her pregnancy. She'd almost forgotten how visible it was, now that the bruises and the swollen lips were gone. She looked down, pressed her hand against the curve of her stomach. and nodded slowly. 3, if we count you. His brow lifted slightly at that, almost amused, and something flickered at the corner of his mouth. A smile. No, not quite, but close. She smiled for him anyway. They didn't speak again that night, but the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. What woke her was not a sound, but the absence of one, a shift in the wind, a snap of instinct honed by fear. She sat up quickly, eyes scanning the dark, only to find him already on his feet, rifle in hand, posture taut like a bow pulled too tight. He moved fast, silent, crouching near the edge of the thicket and peering down into the trees. Then she heard it. Voices, low, slurred, not far. Boone, she'd know that voice anywhere. He was yelling at someone, probably Carradine, drunken rage laced with frustration. She couldn't make out the words, but she felt the tone like a dagger under the skin. They were close, too close. The Apache held up a hand. Flat palm, wait, then motioned for her to crawl forward, stay low, stay behind the rocks. She obeyed, her breath tight in her throat. The baby shifted inside her, a soft flutter of life against her ribs. Not now, she thought. Please, not now. Boone's voice grew, louder, footsteps crunching dead leaves, lantern light flickering through the pines, then came the shot. Claire flinched, her heart jerking in her chest, but it wasn't near. It was a signal. Split up, Boone bellowed. I want her found, now. They were spreading out. The Apache didn't hesitate. He lifted the rifle and fired once, clean, sharp, not at anyone, but toward the sky. A distraction. In the silence that followed, he grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the western slope. They ran, not fast. Her legs couldn't carry that, but fast enough to vanish into the trees before Boone's voice turned again, frantic, cursing. They moved downhill, across the creek, through a dry wash littered with bones and old trap wire. Then back, up again into thicker timber. It was like falling into a dream, dark and breathless, everything moving at angles she couldn't track. Her lungs burned, her vision blurred. But she didn't stop, she couldn't. Finally, they ducked beneath a fallen cedar, its trunk rotted in the middle, and slid into the hollow space beneath. The Apache pulled her close, his body against hers, his hand pressed lightly over her mouth as Boone and Carradine's boots crunched past just feet away. The world was heartbeat and breath and mud. Then silence. They didn't move for a long time. When it was over and the forest returned to stillness, he looked at her again. Their faces were inches apart. Her breath trembled in her chest, and something passed between them. Old pain meeting new resolve. A vow unspoken. She wouldn't go back, and he would not let them take her. The wind that swept down from the ridgeline after their narrow escape was colder than before, whispering through the pines like a warning spoken in tongues older than either of them. Claire pressed her back against the hollowed cedar, her fingers, trembling not from fear now, but from the slow, inevitable return of awareness. That creeping realization that she had just skirted the edge of Boone's rage once again, and only by the Apache's swift hand was she still drawing breath. She could still hear Boone's voice echoing between the trees, faint now, swallowed by distance and terrain, but it carried that same feral venom, the sound of a man who believed the world owed him everything it had denied. Her hands curled into fists against the earth. That voice would follow her to her grave. It would infect her sleep, her thoughts, the way thunder still lived inside bones long after a storm had passed. The Apache waited until the last of the footsteps faded before he moved. When he did, it was like a shadow dissolving into deeper, dark. No rustle, no word. He shifted from beside her and crouched at the tree line, head lifted, listening. Claire rose on unsteady legs, one hand braced on the cedar's trunk. Her body felt sore and hollow, like it had been wrung out and hung to dry. But the baby was still. The pressure in her back, the dull ache in her belly, those hadn't worsened. Yet. She let her palm rest on her stomach, and whispered something only the baby could hear. Not yet, just a little longer. He returned moments later, a finger pressed to his lips, though she already knew to be silent. He motioned southeast, then paused to draw another quick map into the soft dirt, with a piece of ash, lines, landmarks, a river bend. Then his finger jabbed a small X into the center of an outcropping, surrounded by hash marks. That's where they were going. She nodded. They didn't speak for hours. The night gave way to brittle morning, and still they moved, cautious, deliberate, threading between deer paths and crumbling ravines where the bones of old trees jutted like broken ribs. The cold was bone deep now, not sharp but heavy, the kind of chill that gripped your lungs and made each breath feel like it came with a cost. Claire's coat, which she'd stolen from Boone's camp on the night of her escape, was beginning to stiffen at the seams. She pulled it tighter around her belly. The Apache offered her no words, but when they paused at midday beneath the yawning arms of a stone overhang, he passed her his last strip of pemmican without hesitation. She ate it in silence, ashamed she had no way to return the gesture. They rested for only minutes before the Apache stood, eyes narrowing at something in the distance. Then he lifted his rifle, not to fire, but to point, and Claire saw what had caught his eye. Smoke, thin and grey, curling just above the tree line far across the valley. Boone. She didn't need to ask. It was him. The bastard had lit a campfire, bold and careless, a flare to mark his path like he didn't fear being tracked himself. Maybe he didn't. He believed the land owed him a woman, a child, a legacy. He believed God had handed him dominion, and that Claire had simply forgotten her place. But she had not forgotten. She remembered every time Boone shoved her, every time he spat promises into the dirt like seeds that only grew thorns. She remembered the night he claimed her in her father's name, handed a bottle and a deed, and dragged her into a stable like it was a church. Her screams drowned beneath laughter. And when the first blood came, when her belly began to swell, he never looked at her the same again, as if something sacred had been defiled by accident, as if she had dared to make herself a woman, when all he wanted was a compliant girl. The Apache grunted, pulling her thoughts from the abyss. He motioned onward, faster this time, no longer circling Boone's path, but cutting across it, toward the rise of high rock and thicker brush where no lantern could pierce. They'd been avoiding that terrain until now. Too exposed, too rough. But something had changed. Boone was closing in too quickly. They needed to vanish entirely, and there was only one place to do it. The shale teeth. That's what settlers had called the jagged ridgeline Claire now found herself staring at. Massive broken rock that jutted from the earth like the spine of some long-dead god. It wasn't a path. It wasn't even a climb. It was a trial. But the Apache moved with certainty, tracing footholds where she saw none, guiding her gently but firmly, always one step ahead to catch her if she faltered, and she did. Her feet slid on loose gravel, her knees buckled, her fingers tore on stone, but she kept moving, teeth clenched against every groan. She wouldn't give him reason to turn back. She would not be Boone's prize again. By dusk, they crested the ridge. What waited beyond was a hidden canyon, a bowl of land so sunken and still, so green and shadowed, Claire couldn't believe it had remained untouched. A spring ran through its belly, rimmed by moss and soft reeds, and along one side stood the remains of what must have once been an Apache encampment, low stone circles, a cooking pit, old wooden beams blackened with age. Ghosts of lives lived in silence. The Apache paused at the edge, his breath slow, reverent. Claire felt it too. The canyon didn't just hide them, it protected them, it watched them. He led her to the far end, beneath an overhang where dry grass had been laid in an old hunter's nest. She sat carefully, her bones grateful beyond words, and leaned back with a groan. He watched her for a long moment, then turned and disappeared into the trees. When he returned, he held roots, berries, bark. medicine. He ground them with stone and soaked cloth, then knelt beside her, lifting her shirt gently, respectfully. She flinched at first, but he paused until she nodded. Then he pressed the mixture against her back, her ribs, her thighs, all the places where Boone's boots had left their memory. She sucked in a breath. It burned, but she bore it, because he did not touch her like Boone had. He touched her like a man tending a fire. That night, she dreamed. She dreamed of chains breaking, of hooves pounding through snow, of Boone's face twisted in fury as the Apache walked into his campfire, silent and unafraid, lifted her over his shoulder, and disappeared into the black. She dreamed of blood in the snow, of freedom. Dawn crept in slowly, bleeding across the horizon in slashes of dull red and bruised purple, casting long shadows across the canyon walls, where Claire lay curled. Beneath the overhang, her breath shallow but steady. Her body ached in every place it could ache, and some it should not, but the baby stirred only faintly, offering a quiet assurance she clung to with both hands. Around her, the world was wrapped in a veil of frost, the kind that clung to bark and lips and the fine ends of hair like silver thread. It was quiet in a way no place ever was near Boone, and that silence felt like salvation. She didn't want to move. She didn't want to speak, even to herself, as if her voice might wake the nightmare again. But the Apache was already awake. He moved through the canyon with the grace of a shadow, collecting small limbs from beneath the frost-hardened bushes, harvesting more roots from near the spring's edge, always listening, always aware. He paused once, kneeling at the place where a rabbit trail crossed through the frost, and Claire watched him from her bed of dried grass, with a growing ache in her chest. It was not just the exhaustion of escape, nor the sharp bite of bruises, settling into their final color. It was something older, something deeper, the realization that in all her life, not a single man, not her father, not Boone, not a soul, had ever moved around her with this kind of care, this kind of quiet respect, as if her pain was not a nuisance to be ignored, but a compass by which he adjusted his every step. He returned to her with a pouch of dried meat and half a flask of water. He handed them over without a word, but his eyes flicked to her belly, not with doubt, not with distaste, but with the unspoken awareness that time was running out. Claire drank deeply. The water was cold enough to hurt, but it pushed the fog from her mind, and with it came the creeping worry that Boone was not done. Men like him never were. And if he followed their trail to the edge of this hidden canyon, he'd burn the trees, just to smoke them out. She tried to stand. Her legs shook, but she got there. The Apache didn't reach for her, not unless she needed it, and when she steadied, he only gave a nod and turned away, trusting she would follow, and she did. Every step felt like it chipped something off her. Pain, yes, but something else too. Fear, shame, the skin of a life she had never wanted but had worn like armor because no one offered her another choice. The sun climbed higher as they moved deeper into the canyon, down through old game trails and across patches of earth where deer tracks dotted the mud. The Apache stopped often now, ears tilted like a fox catching vibrations only the wild could carry. Once, he crouched suddenly, eyes narrowing, and Claire froze mid-step. He pressed his fingers to the ground, studied something invisible to her, then pointed. A footprint, large, booted, fresh. Claire's heart dropped into her stomach. Boone. He was here. She saw it in the Apache's jaw, the sudden tightness there. He didn't curse. He didn't draw his blade. He only moved faster, not panicked, controlled, with purpose. They took a new path, climbing toward a natural split in the rock that led into the second bend of the canyon. Claire struggled to keep pace, but something had shifted in her too now, a fierce desire to not be the woman who needed rescuing anymore, to be something else, something stronger. They came upon a cave just past midday. It was narrow, half concealed, behind a curtain of dead vines, but the Apache ducked into it without hesitation. Claire followed, her body screaming against every movement. Inside, it opened into a small chamber carved by time and water, dry and dark, with soot still clinging to the ceiling. Someone had once made fire here. Maybe the Apache himself. Maybe his father. Whoever it was, they'd survived here. And so would she. She sat near the back, stretching her legs as far as she dared. Her breath slowed, and for the first time in days, she let her shoulders fall. The Apache stood at the entrance, a still figure against the shifting light, eyes scanning the woods. Minutes passed. Then he spoke, not in English, not in anything she could understand. But it was a whisper, low and rhythmic, like prayer. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask. She only watched. And somewhere inside her, something softened. When night fell again, the cave turned cold. He built a fire, small and hidden behind a rise of stone, its light contained. Claire leaned toward it, her hands trembling as the warmth began to return. She wanted to speak, to say something of the gratitude swelling in her throat. But no words came. Not for a long time. When she did speak, it was barely more than a whisper. "Why did you come for me?" The Apache didn't look up from the fire, but he answered, because no one else would. 3 days passed, each one a mixture of silence and motion. The Apache led her deeper still into the wilderness, avoiding every trail, every sign of men. He taught her to walk quieter, to find water in dry places, to listen for the voice of the forest instead of fearing it. He never touched her except to guide. He never looked at her like Boone had, and in his presence, she began to remember who she had once been. Claire hadn't always been a possession. She had been a girl who climbed trees, who raced barefoot across fields, who once believed that love meant safety. Boone had killed that girl, or tried to. But with each step she took beside the Apache, she found pieces of herself that Boone had failed to destroy. But nothing good lasts long in a land ruled by men with guns. On the 4th night, as they reached the edge of a high ridge overlooking a vast dry basin, they saw smoke again. Not from a campfire, from a burned tree. A signal. Boone was not just tracking them now, he was calling others. Mercenaries, ranch hands, men owed favors. Men who'd seen Claire once and wanted to again. The Apache stared at the smoke for a long time, unmoving. Then he turned, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something dangerous behind his eyes. He did not lead her away. He led her toward it. The basin stretched before them, like a great sun-scarred scar carved into the land, ringed by jagged hills and the black skeletons of wind-torn trees. Smoke slithered upward from a fresh burn down near the riverbed, the acrid stench riding the wind like a warning. The Apache crouched low on the ridge, stone-faced, a still figure etched against the raw horizon, and Claire knelt beside him, her heart thudding not from fear anymore, but from something more primal. She had been prey for so long, hunted by men who mistook brutality for power. But this wasn't fear running through her veins now, it was fire. She glanced sideways, the light catching her face, and for a heartbeat, the wind caught her hair, like a banner in the dawn. Boone was down there. She knew it. And that knowledge didn't hollow her out like before. It forged something instead, something sharp. The Apache reached into the pouch tied to his side, unwrapped a tightly folded cloth, and produced what looked like a bone-handled blade and a single-shot pistol. Claire stared, not at the weapons, but at his face. It had changed. Not in expression, he never showed much, but in presence. The stillness was gone. Now he vibrated with a tension that only warriors knew. He was preparing for war. But war, not for glory or vengeance. This was something else, something older. Older than Boone, older than the land, a kind of justice that didn't need a court or a rope. Just quiet resolve and sharp steel. "I'll go down," Claire said. It shocked her more than him. Her voice had been silent for hours. But the Apache didn't argue. He only looked at her, and in his silence, she felt the full weight of his trust. No man had ever looked at her like that. Not like something fragile to be guarded or broken, but like a living part of the world, capable of shaping it. She held his gaze. He won't expect me to fight, and that was the truth. Boone had always seen her as something to own, to parade, to possess. Even now, after she had slipped through his fingers like dust, he wouldn't believe she could be dangerous. But she could, and she would be. The Apache touched his chest with 2 fingers, then pointed to the eastern edge of the basin. A path, steep, narrow, but hidden. He would circle wide, come from behind, draw their eyes. Claire would move low, straight down the dry wash where the fire hadn't touched, using the heat shimmer to mask her figure. She nodded once. They moved. The descent was brutal. The rocks crumbled underfoot, and the wind howled like it had something to say about this whole affair. But Claire moved like a shadow, low and steady, each step deliberate. Her bruised legs screamed. Her hands bled from gripping the shale, but none of it mattered. Boone had taken everything from her. This was about getting something back, not just revenge, not even freedom. This was about the woman she used to be. No, the woman she could have been if men like Boone didn't exist. That woman deserved a chance. And if Boone wanted to kill her again, he'd have to do it looking her in the eye this time. By the time she reached the edge of the riverbed, the smoke was clearer. A crude camp had been built between 2 boulders, 3 horses, 4 bedrolls, and a small cooking fire still smouldering from the night. Boone sat near the center, boots stretched, a bottle in hand, one arm slung around the shoulder of some pale-eyed drifter who looked more dead than alive. 2 other men were nearby, both armed, both half drunk. And then, tied to a post near the fire, was a woman. Claire's breath caught. It wasn't her reflection she saw. It was another girl. Younger, barefoot, maybe 16, face bruised, mouth gagged, her stomach twisted. Boone hadn't come just to get her back. He'd come to replace her. She moved, not with noise, not with panic, but with purpose. She reached the edge of the camp unseen. The Apache wasn't in position, yet. She didn't know if he ever would be. But this couldn't wait. Not if another girl was about to be broken the same way she had been. Claire picked up a stone, heavy, fit right in her palm. She weighed it, considered the distance. The first man stood with his back to her, rifle propped on his shoulder like he expected nothing but boredom. She threw the stone. It hit with a solid crack, right against the base of his skull. He dropped without a sound. The second man turned. Saw her raised his rifle, but too late. She was already on him. She slammed the butt of the fallen man's gun into his chest, then again across his face. He fired wide. The shot echoed through the canyon. Birds took off in a flurry. The girl tied to the post screamed against the gag. Boone stood slowly. His face said it all. Disbelief, anger, then something worse. Fear. "Claire," he breathed. She raised the rifle. He laughed. "You don't even know how to shoot." She pulled. The trigger. The shot grazed his shoulder. Not fatal, but enough to drop him to one knee. He screamed, not from the pain, but from the insult. "You bitch," he roared. "I gave you everything. You were nothing." He lunged, but something blurred between them. A shadow, a shape, the Apache. Boone's knife met air, then flesh, but not Claire's. The Apache caught Boone's wrist mid-strike, twisted, and drove his own blade deep into Boone's gut. The man gasped, mouth open in disbelief, blood already pooling down his belly. The Apache didn't speak, didn't gloat. He only watched Boone fall. Then he turned, looked at Claire, and nodded. It was over. She didn't feel it at first. The ending. It didn't arrive like a flood. It seeped in, slow and strange, like light into a darkened room. She stumbled toward. The girl tied to the post, her fingers trembling as she undid the knots, pulled the gag away, murmured soft words. Even she didn't fully understand. The girl sobbed into her shoulder, and Claire held her like she had never been held. Gentle, steady, whole. The Apache burned the camp. All of it, the bedrolls, the bottle, the men. He said nothing as the fire climbed into the sky. Claire stood beside him, the girl curled in a blanket near the ridge. The smoke painted the canyon red. She reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. "You didn't have to save me," she said. He looked at her then, and for the first time he smiled. Not wide, not soft, but real. "I didn't," he said. "You saved yourself." The fire had long since burned to black ash, but its smoke lingered in Claire's nose and clothes, woven into her skin like a scar that would never quite fade. She sat at the ridge above the canyon where Boone had once laid out his vision of empire, now nothing more than a heap of scorched canvas and charred bone. The girl, her name was Maria, she'd whispered that much in the safety of Claire's arms, slept under a borrowed blanket by the embers, her face pale in the moonlight, her lips parted as if still gasping from a dream. The Apache sat a few paces away, sharpening a blade he had already used to kill twice. The sound of stone against steel was rhythmic, not rushed, like a man in no hurry, yet with no time to waste. Claire looked at her hands. They still shook, but not from fear. Not anymore. There had been a change in her she couldn't name. Not yet, but she felt it in the way her breath came easy now, how her spine didn't bow even when exhaustion tried to drag her down. The moment Boone's blood hit the dirt, something had broken, open in her. She hadn't just survived, she had reclaimed something that had been taken from her before she even knew to fight for it. A sense of self. A defiance. She stood, walked slowly toward the Apache and sat beside him. The wind curled through the rocks above them, carrying with it the whisper of distant wolves and the faint howl of wind dragging its feet across the dry earth. "What now?" she asked, voice low. He didn't stop sharpening. His eyes stayed fixed on the blade's edge. "Now we keep walking." "Where?" He paused then, looked up. "Do you need a where?" Claire thought about it. The old Claire. He would have. She needed maps and plans, promises from men who always betrayed them. But now, she turned and looked at the stars above. So many, so unblinking, scattered across the sky like tiny eyes watching the earth hold its breath. "No," she said. "I don't." The Apache nodded once, not like a man agreeing, but like a teacher, watching a student come to the truth on her own. Then he rose. Without a word, he walked to Maria and lifted her gently in his arms. Claire followed, slinging the empty rifle across her back. They walked together out of the basin, stepping over the ash of Boone's would-be kingdom, past the bodies, past the old ghosts, and into the mouth of the eastern hills, where the trail bent toward the unknown. 3 days passed. They didn't speak much. There wasn't need to. The rhythm of travel, the rustle of brush, the quiet crunch of boot over stone, the calls of birds wary and wild, became a kind of language. Maria regained strength quickly. She was a wiry girl, used to hard living, and Claire could see the glint of something fierce behind her young eyes. That fire had nearly been extinguished. Boone would have smothered it completely. But now it flared back to life with every step she took, every meal she ate beside their campfires. The Apache said her name once. Just once. And Maria had looked up at him like he was a ghost that had returned from some long-forgotten legend. Claire had asked him his name on the second night. He hadn't answered at first, just looked at the fire. But later, as they climbed a ridge under the weight of dusk, he said, "They used to call me Taji." "Used to?" she asked. He didn't answer. But he didn't need to. She understood. Names were what the world called you when it still thought it had the right to define you, when it tried to shape you into something small. Taji wasn't a man bound by names anymore. He was a blade in the dark, a hand outstretched in silence, a promise kept without ever being spoken. By the fifth night, they had reached the far edge of the painted lands, where the sky cracked open into endless golds and rust reds, and the earth swallowed sound like a tomb. It was here, among the strange rock formations that rose like petrified spirits, that they met others. A camp, 5 wagons, all damaged, 3 surviving men, gaunt and hollow-eyed, children asleep in coils of blankets, a pregnant woman weeping softly by the fire. Claire and Taji approached without weapons drawn. The moment they stepped into the firelight, the entire camp froze. One of the men reached for a rifle, but stopped cold when Taji raised a single hand. Not threatening, not challenging, just calm. Claire stepped forward. She saw it in their eyes, the same look she and Maria must have worn weeks ago. Hunger, fear, exhaustion that cut deeper than flesh. "We're not here to take," she said. "We're here to share." The woman by the fire stared at her, eyes wide. "You escaped them." It wasn't a question. Claire nodded slowly. "We heard the gunshots," another said. "The ones down by the river. Figured it was bandits turning. On each other." "It was worse," Claire replied. "But it's done." The fire crackled between them. The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. But then the woman nodded. She moved aside, made space near the warmth, and for the first time in weeks, Claire sat among others, without dread clenching her chest. Taji didn't sit. He stood on the edge of the circle, eyes on the dark, watching, always watching. That night, they shared stories in broken phrases and long silences. Claire didn't tell them everything, only what mattered. That they had all lost something, but they hadn't lost themselves. That there were still people, silent ones, who would break into the dark to rescue what others threw away. By morning, Maria was laughing. It was a thin, fragile sound, but it was real. Taji turned to leave. Claire followed. "Where will you go?" she asked. "Back," he said. "Back where?" He looked at the horizon. "Where the next girl waits." She stepped in front of him. "You don't have to go alone." He considered that. "You sure?" he asked. Claire didn't answer. She just started walking beside him. And together, they vanished into the rising sun. 2 ghosts turned flesh, moving not towards safety, but toward the heart of a country that had tried again and again to bury them both. But the land, even this cruel, blood-soaked land, couldn't kill what refused to stay silent. The snow had stopped sometime near dawn, but the cold had settled deeper than ever, curling its fingers into every crack of stone and fold of skin. Thick frost clung to the bark of the ponderosa pines overhead, their limbs drooping beneath the weight. In the hollow between 2 ridgelines, the small group had found shelter beneath a narrow rock overhang, the earth beneath them frozen hard, but still better than the open exposure they'd endured since fleeing the ranch. Smoke from the tiny fire they'd built drifted straight up into the trees, almost invisible in the grey morning light. Clara sat wrapped in an old blanket of coarse buffalo hide, its fur worn patchy but warm. She didn't speak, hadn't spoken since they'd stopped. Her eyes had gone wide and distant again, the way they had when her father had dragged her through the front gate of the Holloway homestead like a prize goat, when the old man in the blood-red vest had grinned at her with crooked yellow teeth and said she'd fetch a strong son. But now she stared forward, silent, a raw edge behind her stare. Like something had torn but hadn't bled yet. Her wrists, still ringed with bruises from the iron manacles, rested in her lap. Though loosened, they throbbed angry and dark against her pale skin. The Apache scout crouched by the fire, motionless save for the way his fingers shifted near the embers, feeding it carefully with the smallest of twigs. He hadn't given his name, and she hadn't asked. Not yet. He moved like smoke, soundless, elusive, disappearing if one looked too long. His hair was tied back, dark as a raven's wing, his face smudged with ash and mud for camouflage. In the past 2 days, he had spoken fewer than a dozen words. None had been wasted. Milo was awake, sitting with his knees drawn up, coat pulled tight, watching the scout with the wide eyes of a boy who had seen a man kill for the first time, and kill without flinching. There had been no shouting, no wild gunfire when they'd escaped. Just the silent crack of a thrown tomahawk, the dull thud of a falling body, and then the cold press of a hand on Clara's shoulder urging her to run. She hadn't even realized until they were halfway down the ravine that she was free. Free. The words still didn't fit. It felt like borrowed clothing, loose and unfamiliar. "You should eat," Milo whispered to Clara, offering her a strip of dried meat from the scout's satchel. She shook her head. He didn't press. The scout glanced over once, then stood in a slow, fluid motion and walked toward the slope above them, bow in hand, vanishing behind the tree line without a word. The boy watched him go, his breath misting in the cold. "What do you think he's looking for?" Clara answered this time, though her voice cracked like ice. "Signs, tracks, or maybe he just can't stand being still." Milo blinked, surprised she'd spoken at all. "Do you think he'll come back?" She turned to him slowly. "He came for us, didn't he?" They had not yet crossed fully into safe land. The Holloway men would be hunting. She'd heard her father bark those orders. Every able man, every horse to track them. Not just because she was gone, but because she was taken. Because an Apache had broken her out under cover of night. Because it made him look weak, and Joseph Holloway could not stand to look weak. Clara could still hear the sounds, the crunch of snow under moccasins, the ragged breath in her lungs, the wild hammer of her heartbeat as the iron key clicked into the lock, as the chain dropped, and the scout's hand caught her arm before she collapsed. He hadn't smiled, he hadn't spoken, he'd just acted. In the years she'd spent being traded like chattel, bartered between men who only valued her as a womb and a dowry, it was the first time someone had done something for her and not said a word about it. She remembered the way he had carried her when her legs failed, her frozen fingers curled into the fur collar of his coat. She had expected to feel shame, but all she'd felt was exhaustion and warmth. His scent, smoke and pine and leather, was still in her nostrils. When he returned an hour later, he knelt beside the fire and set down a bundle wrapped in cloth. 2 rabbits, cleaned and gutted. Milo's eyes lit up. Clara didn't react. The scout met her gaze, and for a long moment neither looked away. Then, softly, he said, "We go soon." His voice, rare and low, came like the first drop of rain after a long drought. It startled her, not because he spoke, but because it reminded her that this wasn't a dream. She nodded. "I'm ready." The trail he led them on was not one of open plains or beaten paths, but the hidden veins of the land. Animal trails, dry washes, gullies buried beneath snow and lined with rocks, places no white man would follow, where horses would falter and guns would rust. The scout never hurried, but he never stopped either. He moved with a strange rhythm, one that ignored the sun and seemed to follow something else, some memory, or scent or pulse beneath the earth. At night, they slept in places only wolves knew, inside fallen logs, beneath the low arch of stone bridges, curled in hollows covered with pine boughs. And each morning, Clara found herself a little closer to herself again. Not whole, but closer. Her hands grew steadier, her thoughts clearer, her dreams less haunted. Still, she didn't know his name. She didn't ask. He had saved her without knowing hers. The silence between them had become something sacred. It wasn't until the 3rd night, when Milo had fallen asleep and the fire was little more than coals, that she spoke without prompting. "My father said I was too soft," she said, staring into the glow. "Said women like me were made to be owned, passed between men like land and cattle. And the worst part is, I believed him." The scout didn't answer right away. She didn't expect him to, but after a moment he reached into his coat and pulled out a stone. Flat, round, the surface carved with patterns. He handed it to her. She turned it over in her palm. It was warm from his body heat. "What is it?" "Moonstone," he said. "Carried by women of my tribe when they birth. For strength. For the child. For the journey." Clara looked up. Her throat tightened. "Why give it to me?" He didn't answer, but his gaze held hers, steady and calm. That was enough. By the 5th day, the sound of riders reached them. Far, behind, too far to see, but close enough that the scouts' posture changed. They stopped building fires. They moved only at night. Milo's spirits dimmed again. Clara's stomach twisted. Her body ached in new ways. The baby, still small, had begun to stir more. The fear crept back. But on the 6th day, they reached the bluff. It was a narrow ridge between two rivers, where the land dropped steeply into a basin of red stone. From here, if they could cross and reach the other side, there would be a Lakota, camp 2 days' walk north, a place of protection, where the Holloways could not go. They stood together at the edge as the sun bled across the horizon, in streaks of blood orange and rose. Clara held the moonstone in her hand. The scout knelt beside Milo, tying the boy's boots tighter. Clara turned to him. "What's your name?" He looked up, paused, then said simply, "Taza." She nodded. The name felt right. She placed her hand over her belly, and for the first time in months, felt something like hope. "We'll make it," she said. Taza stood, nodded once, and began the descent, and she followed.